Okay, I said, are we on? Okay, so we were supposed to start 5 minutes ago, and we're going to go ahead and start in 60 seconds. If you're still in here in 60 seconds, then you have to find a seat. got some folks that are waiting. Back in the morning. Well, like it or not, you're going to get an abbreviated class, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about worship and what worship looks like and where it happens. And of course, it's going to take me to one of my favorite stories, which I don't know why I ever say that, because I say that about nearly every story. But it's a story that is like it hits home to a lot of people. In fact, about 3 years ago, I preached a sermon very similar to this story, and we talked a lot about it. But I want to go back, and I have a little different angle that I wanted to think about this morning, especially when we talk about worship. Worship almost seems to be synonymous with victory. It's a celebration. It's a time when we come together, and so it's a little difficult when we do come together on a Sunday morning. And a lot of people think, well, we come here to worship, and that means we're going to celebrate. And so for some people, it's like, well, that means we're singing loud and we're raising our hands and we're dancing before the Lord with all our might. And that is a valid act of worship. And I encourage you to think about that. I encourage you to model that in your life on Sunday mornings and Monday mornings and Tuesday mornings. I do think it's important that when we worship with all of our hearts. And if you remember that story, David was kind of reprimanded by his wife, Michal, who saw that and said, kings shouldn't do that. Like, kings should be the ones who have the most respect and the most honor, and he's out there dancing in his linen ephod, and that just ain't right. And so he came in the door, and he's super excited, and she goes to chewing on him, and that didn't turn out too well. But I also think that worship sometimes happens in really tough times. And so for some of you, when we talk about worship, when you come in here, it's not dancing with all your might. It's not hands raised. It's brokenness. And I just want you to know that worship happens in both of those ways and in every place in between. I think on my life, and some of the most impactful times of worship happen in some really tough places. And without going into too great of detail, because some of you have heard this story before, but for those of you who didn't know, I had a son who graduated, and so we had family who came in, and my wife's two sisters and their family came in, and just so good to have them here with us. My dad also came in, and that's something that I didn't think would happen. Because when I was Lily's age, when I was 15 years old, my dad was in a really terrible helicopter accident. And some of you may remember me sharing that story. But I'll tell you this, when I think about worship, and when I think about true worship in my life, I immediately go back to that waiting room when I was a freshman in high school, and I was told, we don't think your dad's going to make it. You know, broken arms, broken legs, broken back, broken neck, all these issues. Like the likelihood that he'll make it the next 24 hours is really low. And I just remember worship becoming very real in that place. And I don't have a great memory, but I can remember the color of the linoleum floor in that hospital in Dallas. And I can remember being surrounded by people. And the way that we worshiped in that room was so different than how we worshiped this morning. It wasn't a sense of celebration. It wasn't a sense of victory. It was our cries and our pleas to God. And that's worship. And so I want to talk a little bit about the fact that instead of building up for worship in that big moment, to realize that we have a call to worship every single day. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Valley of Elah this morning. Is anybody familiar with the Valley of Elah? Anybody know where that is? If I told you the Garden of Eden, you'd be like, oh yeah, I know where that is. If I said the Garden of Gethsemane, you'd be like, oh yeah, I know where that is. If I said Mount Sinai, you'd be like, oh yeah, I know where that is. I say the Valley of Elah, and you're like, I don't know what that is. Let me Google that one real quick. So the Valley of Elah was just that. It was this valley, and it was along the border. And on the northern border was a group of mean, angry, snarling Philistines who had taken up the ridge on the northern side. And on the southern side of the valley, that ridge belonged to the army of Israel, and they had lined up. And no one would dare go into that valley. Why not? You give up the high ground if you go down into that valley. You don't do that. That's strategically the worst thing that you can do, because then you go down into the valley, your opponents can then shoot down on you as you're trying to make your way up, and it is suicide. So nobody wanted to go down in the valley, and they knew that this was bad news until this big guy from his hometown of Gath stepped up, and he goes down in that valley. And it didn't take as near as many steps for him to get to the bottom as it would most people, because his name was Goliath, and he was somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.5 to 9.5 feet tall. Right? So this is one tall. And he's not just tall. You know, you think of tall people, I think of the NBA, and I think of Manute Bol, or I think of Sean Bradley, and these 7 foot 6 inches tall, but they were pretty slender guys, both of them. What we know about Goliath is that he was humongous. He wasn't just tall. His armor weighed 125 pounds, which was probably more than David weighed himself. In fact, the tip of his spear weighed 12 pounds. Think about 12 pounds and how much. Can you imagine? Like when I go bowling, I want to get like the smallest ball possible so I can feel like a real man as I'm like hurling it down the lane. Like a 12-pound ball is heavy. Can you imagine like gluing that 12-pound ball onto the end of like an 8-foot stick and then holding it out? Like it would just be, there's no way I could do it. Right? And that was his spear. And so he's out there. And when we talked about this several years ago, I really wanted to talk about, and I'll talk a little bit about again, is the fact that the miracle wasn't what we think it is. Right? Because everybody hears Goliath, and what do you think of? You think of big, you think strong, you think unstoppable, unbeatable. Right? And so here you have Goliath. He's somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. David is probably coming in at, 5'6", $125. I mean, just this kid who comes up, and he's going to go visit his brothers. But prior to that happening, Goliath is down in the valley, and he's calling out Israel. And this isn't unusual. This is pretty common, right? Because the last thing you want to do as a nation is always have your army fighting. Because even when you win, you still lose, right? Because you're still going to lose some of your army. And what you don't want to do is go around and always battle and continue to lose your army. And so what they would do at that time is they would select a champion. And Goliath was the champion. And that was good news for the Philistines. It was pretty much bad news for the Israelites. Because nobody wanted to go down the valley, because whoever won between the two champions would win, and that nation could then absorb the army and the people and the resources there, and they would become slaves. And so what you really wanted to do is get that one good champion, and Goliath was it. And he goes down there, and for 40 days, almost a month and a half, every day he's down there and he's just mocking him. I mean, his throat's got to be sore. He's got to be hoarse. I mean, he's just going after him. And then he's down in the valley, and up on the ridge, you have all these Israelites, and they are literally shaking in their boots. And they're afraid. And then David comes in on the scene. David goes to see his brothers because his dad said, hey, I want you to go visit your brothers, take some bread, take some cheese, go give it to, their commanding officers and check in on them. Like, David is literally like the first Uber Eats ever, right? He's been called out. He's the DoorDash, right, Blake? He's going to go there. He's going to see his brothers. He is not sent on a mission. Dad doesn't say, hey, there's going to be this big giant I want you to go take out while you're there. He says, just go check on your brothers. He goes to check on his brothers. His brothers see him. In some ways it's almost like this Joseph-like relationship, because his brothers don't seem to care for him too much. They're like, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be back at home? Like, who's looking after the sheep, David? They kind of tease him. They kind of pick on him a little bit. And, Joseph had been the favorite, and that bothered his brothers a little bit. David already, he's got a little bit of clout, because if you remember one story ago when we look at David, there's a guy named Samuel who shows up and anoints David king and then leaves, but David doesn't become king. He goes back out to the big dumb sheep and he looks after him. Right? So he shows up, he's got the bread, he's got the cheese, he sees his brothers. His brothers, were like, what are you doing here? And then he hears this noise. He's like, what's going on? Who is this? He starts asking around. They're like, this guy's named Goliath. They grow him bigger in Gath. And he's mad and he's looking for a fight. And Goliath is not only making fun of Israel, he's making fun of the God of the Israelites. And David says, this is ridiculous. Somebody's going to go stop him. And basically David says, none of you are going to do it. I'm going to go do it. God will give me the victory. Word gets back to Saul. Saul calls in David. David shows up. Saul says, you're the only one brave enough to do it. We've run out of options. Take my armor, go put it on, go fight me. He puts the armor on. He says, no, this is not going to work. I can't move around, right? So he says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it my way. Now, here's something that's really interesting. We talked about this several years ago, so I don't want to go into great detail, but I love this. And this is a story I want you to relate to your seniors as they get ready to go out. Everybody talks about David and Goliath, and who's the clear champion of this story? Who should win this one? Goliath. Anytime, if you've never been to church and somebody says David and Goliath is the big guy who's supposed to win, right? But if you go back and look and you study and you look at military and you look at how things work, like Goliath might not have been the big champion that everybody thought he was going to be. Because back then, their strategy wasn't quite like we have now. Basically, it was a game of rock, paper, scissors, right? You have the infantry. They can beat the cavalry, the mounted horses. The cavalry can beat the artillery, which is the bows and the slings. But then the slings and the bows, they can beat infantry. And this is especially the case when we talk about David and Goliath, because Goliath is really, really big. He's got lots of armor, and he's really slow. And there's some who even believe that maybe he had an eye problem, Or maybe he's just trying to coax or coerce David. Because several times he keeps telling David, hey, come closer, come closer. Because David knows if he can get his hands on that little runt, it is all over. But David keeps his distance until he decides it's time to attack. And then he runs. He's quick. He's deadly. Right? They have reliefs. They have pictures of slingers back in the old times before Lynn. So really, really old times. Right? And they had pictures of them literally picking birds out of the air with these slingshots. They also, I watched this show several years ago when I was studying this, and Discovery Channel said, hey, what's the story about David and Goliath? Could it really happen? And they took these slingers, and slingshots aren't like this, right? That's what we grew up with. Slings were like this. And they said because of the size of the projectile and the speed in which they could come out, and clearly they were accurate, they said the speed in which it would come out and the force, it had the same stopping force or the same newtons as a .45 caliber gun. And so not only were they accurate, had all this power, and he was fast. And so really, in all honesty, if we want to look at this, and I'm not trying to kick your faith or try to take away the power of God, but it really wasn't just that amazing that David beat Goliath. He's faster. He's more nimble. He can hit at range. Goliath had no chance. And some of you are saying, okay, I don't like this story because that's taking away the miracle and the power of God. I absolutely believe that there is a miracle that took place, but I don't think it had to do with the stone as it came out of the sling of this boy. Okay, I really think there was a miracle, and I think God did a very powerful thing, but I don't think it had anything to do with David and his sling. And I'll tell you why I like to talk about this. For two reasons. One, a lot of us don't have the talents like David had. And we tell the story of David and Goliath, a lot of us can say, you know what, I'm not really like David. I don't have that talent. I can't hit a bird out of the air. You know, if I tried to take one of those slings, I would swing it about 4 times and it would hit me in the face and I would be the one that would fall down. And so we say, you know what, that story is for the uber talented people. And so that's one of the reasons why the story of David and Goliath needs to be retold. But the second reason, and the most important reason, is I think too many times we focus on giants. And I think too many times we think about the battlefield when we're surrounded by a bunch of people and everything is on the line. And that's when we say, okay, now I need to fight. This is the moment. And I just don't know that we haven't really missed what's going on. Because I don't think the story of David and Goliath is about a miracle that took place in a valley. It's about the spiritual formation that took place in a pasture. Remember what he did before he showed up. He was out taking care of those sheep. You know what happened? All in the middle of that, this old guy named Samuel shows up. He's a national figure. He walks into the house. He sees Jesse, and he says, hey, let me see your boy. And he brings up Eliab. And he's got out that anointing oil. This is going to be the king. I mean, he's big and strong and handsome. I mean, they might as well have called him Doug. I mean, this is like the guy, right? He's ready to anoint him. And God says, that's not the one. And well, what about Abinadab? Brings up, oh, he's a good-looking guy. He's strong. He'd make a great king. And God says no. And God, kind of whispers to Samuel. He says, men look on the outside, but I look on the inside. And eventually, when all the brothers have gone by, Samuel's still holding this anointing oil and says, there's not a king here. Is there anybody left? Oh yeah, we got the little one, the run, the youngest. He's out in the field. They bring him in. And I love this because Samuel says, I'm not going to sit down until he comes in here. And they bring him in here, and God says, that's the one, and he anoints him. And you know what happens then? You get the crown. You take him into the palace. Does he give him a sit on the throne? Nope. He goes back out. Can you imagine if somebody came to you and said, you're going to be president? I'm like, okay, let's pack the bags. I'm ready to go. If somebody says, in 2 years, you're going to be president, and then somebody says, hey, will you go outside and feed the dog? Nope. Presidents don't feed dogs. Brothers of presidents might feed dogs. Or servants of presidents might. But I don't feed dogs. I'm not going to waste my time on that. But this is why I love this story. And this is why I really think this is what worship is all about. After he's been told that he's going to be king of Israel, he goes back out. And he could have said, you know what? I don't give a flip about these sheep. They get caught in the thickets and the briars. That's because they're too dumb. I mean, they are not smart animals. You have to lead them. They were always getting in trouble. And you know what? If you're going to be king, do you really worry about a few sheep here and there? There's a lion that shows up. You have at it. It's yours. That one's limping a little bit. Get him off my hands anyway. A bear shows up. But as we read, David continues to do these menial tasks. And in the pasture, when no one else is watching, he protects the sheep and he worships God. I mean, I want to pretend that I'm a manly man, right? Okay, it took 6 months to grow this, but I finally, for the first time in my life, I have facial hair. I know it doesn't look like it, but it's there. If you get closer, you can see I'm a manly man, right? David hung out in the pasture and wrote songs and poems about a God that he loved. And a lot of us would say, well, that's not really that manly. And I'm here to tell you that there is nothing more manly than being able to lift up God in worship. And when you bow down, you lift him up. And for our men in this room, the way that we can be honorable, godly husbands and fathers is when we sacrifice for the families that God has given us, and that we put God first, and spiritually we are the leaders who point to God. And it's not easy, and the world says that's girly, you shouldn't do that, don't get in touch with your feminine side or your emotions. But I think God has called us to be the type of men who will not only stand in front of Goliath in the valley, but will guide the sheep in the pasture. And this is the miracle of David and Goliath. Because it wasn't about the big Goliath that he had to slay. It was about being a man of integrity and one who desired a relationship with God. And that's what he calls us to be. And so if you hear the story of David and Goliath, I'm not saying I don't think there was a miracle. The miracle was in one, that David continually protected and did things when nobody else was watching. And I think the other miracle is that when he showed up and he saw Goliath, God gave him the courage and the faith to say, you know what? No one will talk about my God that way. And so I know some of our seniors they've gone down to class, but we have some young guys in here. And I guess I can call this couple right here young. I mean, it's been a long time since you were in high school now. A few years. What year did you graduate?
14.
Okay, 14. And then you were our intern for another 10 years after that. I mean, we just kept getting you back and back and back and back. And got to watch you guys get married. But for our young ones, and and even our young ones that are just graduated yesterday, and Dimitri over here. I just want you to think about this. You know, when you graduated yesterday, we weren't celebrating the fact that you could do this. Okay? We weren't celebrating the fact that you could make it up the stairs, across the stage, and back down the stairs again. Which, by the way, is still pretty impressive, because there's some people, they don't always make it across there with that. But we weren't celebrating the fact that you walked across the stage. Okay? We weren't celebrating the victory over Goliath in one fell swoop. We celebrated the 13 years that you were in school. The day after day after day that you were in the pasture. The day after day that you had to do homework that you didn't like or didn't understand. That doesn't apply to either one of you, because both of y'all understand better. You were probably teaching the teacher some of the time. But it's just that constant, that's what worship is that daily grind. And so as much as I want us to celebrate the victories of defeating Goliath or the victories of walking across the stage, really worship is that day-to-day honoring God when nobody's looking. And you're going to have some tough days. There are going to be some days that you celebrate. There are going to be some days where you have that moment to stand up and shine. You know, I'm so excited, Kennedy, that you're going off to LCU and you're going to be a chaparral, which I'm not really sure what that is. I think it's like an angry bird. I don't know. But, you're going to be a fighting chap or whatever, chap. And we're excited for you with that. And Brevin, God has blessed you in so many ways. And I just know that you're going to continue to use those talents to bless God and others. But just remember that some of the most powerful times of worship, they might be in a hospital room, or they might be in a dorm room. They might be when you're walking back to the dugout after a strikeout. They might be just be willing to worship God in those tough times. Because if you can't worship Him in those really hard times, then why do we worship Him any other time? He is a God of the ups and downs and the goods and the bads. And for some of you, you are literally facing your giants this week. And for some of you, you're like, I'm still looking after sheep. What am I doing? And I just want to encourage you to be faithful. David could not have killed Goliath in battle if he hadn't been faithful in the pasture. And so now I want to shift in the last 50 seconds of class. I want to say something not to our seniors in high school. I want to talk to our seniors in Fur's cafeteria. This is for the people who you get an extra 25 cents off of your coffee when you walk into McDonald's. Okay, I just want to talk to you for just a second. Okay, I want to thank you for living life in the pasture around some dumb sheep and being faithful in that time and being an example for me and for my family. And if there's those times you say, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know why I'm here and I don't know what God has planned for me, and you say there's not a Goliath to slay, I'm just stuck where I am, I just want you to know there are people who are listening and who are watching. And we are encouraged by the way that you live life every day. And it's not just about those Goliaths, but I want you to know that you're doing powerful things in God's kingdom when you just stay faithful. And I just want to commend you for that. As I'm now entering into really old age. Because once you have a kid who's not in high school anymore, that's when it just really sinks in. Like, I'm old now because I have a kid who's out of the house, at least for a little while. We'll see, maybe summers, and anytime he needs his clothes washed, he'll find his way back home. But I just want to thank you for all of that. This week as you go out and you find yourselves in the pasture, just remember, this is worship. And take time to lift up God as you bow and honor Him. So I want to close this out in prayer, and then we will be dismissed for the morning. One more thing I do want to say. I didn't bring in my Excel spreadsheet, and I should have, but I counted the rolls. And I just counted per roll, because some of them were double and triple, but we ended up collecting over, I think it was 2,300 rolls of toilet paper. And I did the math, because that's what any good nerd would do. It was nearly 40 miles of toilet paper. And even more impressive, it was over 500,000 squares of bath tissue were collected. 500,000. And so, like, those kids, they're either going to have to go on a lot of, like, toilet paper fights in Lubbock, or they're going to be set for a really long time. And I want to thank you again for that. I really appreciate your generosity. I know it was weird to walk out of Walmart with a giant sized roll of toilet paper and people eyeing you, but I do appreciate that. That means so much, and it means a lot to the kids. So Eric Dickey was really appreciative of that. So thank you for all that. So let's close out in prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father God, I thank you for being an awesome God, and just for my family, I just want to thank you for being with us through some ups and downs of the last 18 years, and watching our little boy grow up into a man. And Lord, we know that maturation process is not complete, not in his life and not in my life. But I'm thankful that you're a God who has never given up on us, who never pulled the plug, who never walked away, who never says, I'm just going to give up. But instead, you're a God who remains faithful. And so, God, I just pray that we will be followers who do the same, that when things aren't going the way we want them to, or the way we thought that they should have gone, that we don't walk away, but instead that even when we find ourselves in a pasture surrounded by sheep and no one else is watching, may we continue to be people who just worship you and lift you up. Thank you for being a God who allows us to worship you in the valley of Elah, surrounded by giants, and in the pasture and everywhere in between. Thank you for being a God who is just worthy of our praise. It's in your Son's name that I pray. Amen. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you Wednesday at 6 p.m. You are dismissed.